spare Iraq. The book now moves on to part 2, and there is a single photograph of Harry in military uniform saluting. Part 2 is entitled Bloody but Unbowed. And we move into the new chapter, where we're now in 2007. And it explains that the MOD told the world that he was deploying and that he would be commanding a group of light tanks along the Iraqi border near Basra. He explains that the reaction to this was unusual. Half of the people in Britain were furious, thinking there was pointless sending the Queen's youngest grandson to go, and that it was unwise to send a royal into a war zone, and other people thought, well, it would be a waste of taxpayers' money not to utilise him as he'd been trained as a soldier. And indeed, the insurgents who were trying to create a civil war across Iraq extended a formal invitation which Harry describes as worthy of high tea. Apparently they wrote, "We are awaiting the arrival of the young, handsome, spoiled prince with bated breath." Apparently they were going to kidnap Harry and then decide what to do with him. They threatened to return him to his grandmother without ears. Then he explains that he would have worried about Chelsea being concerned about hearing all of these threats against him, but apparently she'd been so harassed by the press that she unplugged from them. So she took the view that the papers didn't exist and the internet was off limits. And then, 2 months after announcing his deployment, apparently it was called off because British intelligence had found that a photo of Harry had been distributed amongst a group of Iraqi snipers with instructions that he was the mother of all targets. And apparently these snipers were elite. They'd shot 6 soldiers. And therefore the mission had become too dangerous, and he'd been assessed by the head of the army, General Donat, that Harry was a bullet magnet. A statement was issued on his behalf that he was disappointed, which he said was untrue, because he was absolutely crushed at not being able to go. And he was disappointed and crushed because he spent such a long time with the people who were going to be deployed. They become his brother-in-arms, and they were now going, and he was not. He then explains that he pondered quitting the army at this juncture because he thought to himself, well, what's the point if I can't be a soldier? And he discussed it with Chelsea. And she explained that on the one hand, she'd be relieved if he didn't do it, but she also knew how important it was for him to do something. He explains that he'd long been persecuted by the press, that gets mentioned once again, and that the army was a healthy outlet for him. He then decided to talk about it with William, and he was sympathetic, and he explained that most of the time that he and William didn't have any truck with all that air spare nonsense. And however, when it was brought up professionally as to what he was doing, William then looked at the matter on a different level, which of course makes sense because William has one eye on the fact that he's going to be king someday, and therefore it's important what goes on with his younger brother. And accordingly, Harry, switching on Whinger mode, says that he wasn't getting any comfort from any quarter, so he decided to look for it in vodka and Red Bull and gin and tonic, and therefore he was photographed coming out of various pubs and clubs and house parties in the early hours of the morning. And it's interesting, again, that demonstrates that alcohol, and perhaps now or even then, drugs have become a form of crutch for him. Evidently, that is the case for some people, that as a consequence of problems in their lives, they take refuge in excessive intake of alcohol and drug consumption. It's understandable that with some people their lives are so wretched that they want something that doesn't remind them of the reality that they face on each and every day. And this is often spoken about. Of course, with Harry, you might think, oh, you whinging ponce, what on earth have you got to complain about? But of course, I suppose he would say, well, it's all relative, isn't it? Notwithstanding the fact that I'm come from a wealthy background and I have servants doing what I want and I have a press office and I'm part of this huge institution, etc. The fact is that he still has his woes and his problems, and for him, it's evident, at least he admits to here, that he takes refuge in drink in order to deal with them. He explains that he really couldn't stand the fact of waking up, and interesting, he explains that the click from when he was having a photo taken from over his shoulder or behind his back or within his peripheral vision had triggered him. It made his heart race. And then he goes on to say that after Sandhurst, it sounded like a gun cocking or a blade being notched open. And then it became a little more traumatizing, was the blinding flash. Now, of course, this is something that he's made reference to in the past about being traumatized by the flashes of the paparazzi. But again, if that were the case, why does he quite happily stand and have his photo taken with Harry's wife? Is he being a big brave soldier for his wife because she says, "No, Harry, we have to have our pictures taken"? And he thinks, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'll do it." And he pushes through it. Or is it simply the case, in the way that his wife does, he picks and chooses the narrative so that when he's annoyed and irritated by the paparazzi, he's traumatized by the appearance of them and the noise of the clicking and the flashes going off. Yet when he chooses to appear in front of them, he isn't traumatized. Maybe it is that when it's on his terms, he's able to deal with it. But when it's not on his terms, he can't deal with it. Which again shows a lack of fortitude, to my mind, of somebody who's apparently successfully gone through Sandhurst, which is no cakewalk at all. You would have thought that if he could cope with all those colour sergeants and all of the drilling that he went through, which some people couldn't, so to his credit he got through it, you'd have thought that if he was able to deal with all of that he would be able to deal with just some photographers. After all, they've been around him all of his life. And it does seem to me that there might be a bit of a revision of history going on here vis-a-vis the effect that the paparazzi have upon him, and it's being done as a further method of lashing out at them and whinging once again about the way that they carry on. He then, in victim mode, basically contemplates the fact that the army's made him better at apprehending threats and feeling threats, and then become adrenalized in the face of those threats. And having done that, the army was casting him aside. Oh, poor woe is he. He then explains that somehow the paparazzi knew of his sensitivity because they started hitting him with the cameras in the expectation that they retaliate. And apparently a snap of him in 2007 fetched about £30,000. He said, however, if there was a snap of him doing something aggressive, well, that would be a big payday. He said he got into a scrap with some paps and came away with a swollen nose, and his bodyguard was livid. He goes on about the paparazzi and how they were emboldened, radicalized, just like the young men in Iraq had been radicalized. Interesting comparison between those radicalized in Iraq and paparazzi. He then talks about how their mullahs were editors. And he holds out the distinction of the hypocrisy of those editors who promised publicly to do better and not to send photographers chasing after people after his mum's death. But he said nobody seemed to give a shit, and he remembers being swarmed by them outside a club, and they were throwing themselves across the bonnet of a car, and they got football scarves around their faces and hoods over them, the uniform of terrorists. He said it was one of the scariest moments of his life, and he said nobody cared, because they basically formed the view it's the price that you pay. He talks about being close to one of his bodyguards who was called Billy, and he explained that he once jumped on a grenade that somebody had thrown at Harry from a crowd. It wasn't a real one. And he explained on one occasion when he was leaving a club, he said to Billy, "You're going to have to put me in the boot of a car." and apparently it's what his mum used to do as well. So then, when he was ever leaving a pub or a club in 2007, he would have the car pull into a back alley, climb in the boot, Billy would close him in, and he'd lie there, and he would be ferried home. He explained it felt like being in a coffin, but he didn't care. So once again, his hatred of the press is brought in as he expresses his disappointment, of course, of not being able to go to Iraq. And it does seem to create some interesting inconsistencies between someone who'd been involved in the preparation to go to war and had gone through the training process but gets all bent out of shape about some camera clicks and photo flashes. Again, one might have thought this would be something that his numerous therapists would be addressing. And if they were, they haven't done a very good job about it. Coming up next, we find out more about that perennial favourite of his mother. Join me there.